Also, this topic is a very interesting topic. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Um, all right, is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would also request you to, sorry. Let me know in case I'm not audible, because we've been having both power and internet problems since morning. So it would be nice if I get a warning in case I'm not audible, or if something happens, I get logged out. I hope you'd be able to help me log back in. Right. So without much ado, let's start with the topic. Executive functions is a buzzword in today's world. Maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 8 years ago, people were not aware of what executive functions was all about. Why are we talking about executive functions today? I think I'm hoping that we would be able to get that clarified as part of the conversation today. What we need to understand is this is not just one set of cognitive abilities, and it's not any of the routine cognitive abilities that we generally talk of. Not intelligence, we're not talking about maybe sensation or perception, but we're talking of very specific cognitive abilities, right? So by definition, executive functions is an umbrella term which is used to refer to a set of higher level cognitive functions. That's the key point, number one. Second, which is involved in controlling and regulating functions of lower level cognitive processes. And the third key point is that it is responsible or required for any goal-directed behavior. So three components in this definition that is important for us to understand, that it's a set of cognitive abilities, not just one ability. It's involved in control and regulation of lower level abilities. And then we need this for any kind of goal-directed behavior. What do I mean by goal-directed behavior? It's funny because anything we do, unless we're just running around aimlessly, everything we do is goal-directed. The fact that I'm talking to you is goal-directed. The fact that you're taking down notes of what I'm saying, is towards a purpose, that becomes goal-directed. If I were to walk up from here to my neighbor's house, cut across the road, that is also goal-directed behavior. So for any of smooth functioning of such behaviors, we need intact executive functions, right? Often people, when they come to us, they ask us for, what are the services that you can offer? And when we say we only do the executive function training, then the question is, will you do sensory integration? Would my child also need physiotherapy? Should I also do occupational therapy? Why is it that you are not focusing on this, right? The reason why we don't do that is because executive functions is a level higher than sensory and perceptual functions. And by training that, we assume that the lower level functions, which are sensory and perceptual functions, should get regulated over a period of time, even though we don't focus on it directly. When do we need executive functions? When we have to achieve a goal. And like I already told you, most of our behaviors are goal directed, which means without executive functions, we would not be able to have a smooth functioning day. Most of the things that we do on automatic mode, we don't need executive functions. Like when I'm cooking on automatic mode, I don't need executive functions. But if I'm making something, looking at a recipe, if it's something that I'm doing for the first time, or maybe it's an elaborate process that's required and I have a recipe, then I need executive functions, right? And the next time when executive functions is required is when routine attempts are unsuccessful, when there are some obstacles in our goal, right? We are all for example, we wanted to go out for lunch today, just to have a bite after a long time, but then it started raining around lunchtime. So what do? Swiggy cannot happen because it's pouring and we stay in a remote place. then what's the next best option that we can do? So when routine attempts are not enough to control or achieve our goal, then we depend on executive functions, and executive functions will help us to arrive at a solution and for us to be able to achieve our goal. How does it do that? What are some of the qualities of executive functions? And remember, not just one, but all of them. The first thing we need to understand is this is a limited resource. It's a universal phenomena, which means everybody, whether you're in Timbuktu, you're in Africa, you're in US or in India, all of us have executive functions. We're talking of the same executive functions across the globe. This is a limited resource, and it requires effort for us to be able to use it and to achieve our goal, which means that you cannot do it automatically. You cannot do it unknowingly. It is a conscious process. When I say limited resource, I mean, if you are familiar with computer language, let's look at the RAM space in a computer. So RAM space is limited, which means that when I'm working on something, I can only keep these many files open. Beyond those many files, if I have opened, then my computer speed becomes slow, or then it starts freezing, right? That's what RAM means. Similarly, our brain has a limited workspace. The moment that gets taxed, then we start experiencing problems. And all the executive functions will tax this limited resource. All right. So it is used to prioritize behavior. Like I said, if I want to go out for lunch today and it starts raining, what do I prioritize on? Do I prioritize on still making efforts to go out? Or do I prioritize on getting lunch and finishing it and looking at going out on another day? So we need executive functions in order to arrive at this decision. What are the irrelevant informations that are required? My husband is saying maybe you should go out today. Rain is a sign that it's a bad idea for us to go out. Or maybe my daughter is saying my slipper has broken, so I can't come out with you. These are all irrelevant information which needs to be inhibited in order for us to be able to look at the larger picture, which is for me to go for lunch. I need to maintain some information in my short-term memory, which means which is the closest restaurant open to me? Have I already made a reservation? Can I call that person and cancel my reservation? Maintaining information in short-term memory. And for me to be able to switch back and forth, because my daughter's crying, she says, I don't have slippers to wear, and you're insisting that we go out. Even if we book a cab, I can't walk because I don't have slippers. So can I switch between dealing with my daughter's problem and trying to coordinate and find a cab so that we can all go and have lunch today? So switching attention, prioritizing, inhibiting irrelevant material, and maintaining information in short-term memory. All of this requires smooth functioning of various executive functions. And trust me that it seems simple because we do it on a day-to-day basis, but it's not that easy, right? So how do we do this? What does executive functions do? First, it takes into account all the possible options. How heavily is it raining? Does it look like the rain will let up now? Are there any cabs available on Ola or Uber? Is there enough money in my bank? Can I go for lunch today? Or do I have to cook something quickly, and how quickly can I do because my session will start? All of this, all the relevant stimuli we process. Then, just like the name executive, right? The term executive refers to a CEO, just like a CEO in an office. Quickly, the executive functions will take over and start delegating action. You do this, you do that, block this information, pay attention to this. Okay, and it looks like the rain is stopping and the cab is 4 minutes away. Can we all quickly get ready, start looking for the keys, lock up the house and leave? So delegating action to different parts of the brain, blocking irrelevant information, keeping updated on what's happening, and still keeping the goal on track, that we need to have lunch on time today because we can't afford to be late with lunch. So keeping that on our goal. If we look at all of this. That's what executive function does. So just like the CEO of an office, maybe the actual work is done by the walking, the eating, all of that is done by different parts of the body. But the delegation of action, making sure that there is a smooth transition from a planned to a break in the routine, and then to generate a new plan, for that smooth transition, you need executive functions, right? So what happens when executive functions are maybe there is a deficit, or it's not as effective as it should be? One of the first things that research has shown us is that when somebody is struggling in school, right, despite all efforts, maybe you send them for tuitions, you take one-on-one, there is some progress, but you can still see the struggle, then check the executive functions. If you find that there's somebody who's often getting lost, daydreaming. In fact, just the other day, I was talking to a 25-year-old, and he was telling me that he's always had this problem. He is fairly successful. He's finished school. He's finished his, he's a double graduate. He's finished his graduation. He's even got a job. He's working in an office, but he still finds it hard to keep up in a conversation when he has to attend meetings. And since he works in a very high level firm, they expect him to keep up when they're talking to clients. And he feels that every day, the last few hours of the day is where they have client meetings. And he finds it hard to keep up with the meetings because his mind tends to wander. He's physically present, but his mind has wandered. So daydreaming most likely is related to executive function deficits. Poor grades in reading and math, despite the teachers having a sense that this kid is fairly smart, I think he should be able, or she should be able, to achieve whatever it is that we are teaching. But somehow, when we see the child answering in class versus what the child has put on paper on a test or in an exam, there seems to be a disconnect. So poor reading and math skills or poor grades can often be explained on the basis of a weak executive function. And many times, and I've often said this in a lot of my talks, that people with poor executive functions or weaker executive functions sometimes don't even have a learning disability or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but just the fact that they have weak executive functions is enough for them to be struggling in school. So you may not even have a diagnosis pinned on you. Emotional outbursts, children who for no apparent reason seem to get angry, who are hard to please, who are constantly cranky, who seem to be upset all the time. Like I spoke to a couple of parents last week. Both the parents had this to say of two different children: I don't know what makes my child happy. He's always complaining about something or the other. And complaints are such that the child has violent or aggressive outbursts, could be related to deficits in executive functions. One of them, thereafter, we have assessed, and we know for sure that he presented with deficits in executive functions. Stress. A lot of us are stressed, maybe because we're coped up at home. We want to go out, but life is not going back to life as we know it. Or maybe there's some other stress. Our loved one is unwell, or somebody is going through a financial crisis. Stress can cause a decline in executive functions. Of course, that is reversible, but still, it creates a sort of a bottleneck for us. When we look at research evidence, it's really overwhelming. And like I said, 8 years ago, this amount of information was not available. It's now that people are talking about it. If you look at mental health, across the board, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, depression, schizophrenia, dementia, many of these cases. So we are going beyond even childhood. Mood disorders, anxiety and depression, and learning disability. All of these disorders seem to be present. One of the presentations seem to be with executive function deficits. So in ADHD, for example, in schizophrenia, for example, people are moving away from just the medication and looking at cognitive training as an option, cognitive training or training to improve executive functions as means of training or treating these people. There is something, without sounding too technical, there is something which is known as an endophenotype. And it's a very interesting concept, which looks at, we know that both ADHD and learning disability, there is a genetic component to it. So the research that has looked at endophenotypes says that if you look at an unaffected sibling of a child diagnosed with ADHD or learning disability, they will also present with weak executive functions, which means that they may not have a diagnosis of a learning disability or ADHD, but their executive functions may be weak. It may not be as low as that of an ADHD or an LD child, but they also present with lower or weakened executive functions. And therefore, they are what are known as endophenotypes, or they have a genetic expression of the disorder, but it hasn't shown as a phenotype or externally doesn't present as a learning disorder or an ADHD. And so they say, and this now is also true for depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, which means that executive functions seems to act as a precursor for a lot of mental health disorders, many of them which start in childhood. And therefore, and even in unaffected siblings and relatives, there is evidence to say that executive functions is low, and therefore we need to examine executive functions. There are studies which say that even 2 years before somebody is diagnosed as having depression, if you were to assess them on cognitive tests, you will find executive functions are low, which means that the executive functions start reducing, then the symptoms of the disorder come as a consequence of that. And that means that early identification is the key, and the key to identifying early is to evaluate executive functions. Physical health is connected to executive functions in the sense that obesity, poor treatment outcomes, poor adherence to treatment, substance abuse, we're not looking at a disorder or dependence, but even abuse, all of this is related to lower executive functions. People with higher executive functions seem to be happier, lead stress-free lives, regardless of the situation that they're in. They're quick to adapt and easygoing people. School readiness, and this I think is really important for us to look at when we assess children for whether they have pre-academic skills. We often go by the traditional IQ assessment, and then we look at the pre-reading and the pre-academic skills. But now there is enough evidence to say that executive functions, even as young as 3-year-olds to 5-year-olds, if the lower the executive function, the higher the chances of them struggling to keep up in school, which means that executive function seems to be a better predictor of school competence and therefore school success than even entry-level reading and math skills. And that's really important for us to understand that. Job success is dependent on executive function. So not just with children, adolescents, but with adults also. And then a very interesting concept, which of late has caught up quite significantly, is that if we were to live in a crime-free society, if we were to reduce violence, aggression, and risky or reckless behavior, if we were to look at reducing social issues, then executive function seems to be the answer, because people from lower socioeconomic status who are at high risk for some of these problems also present with low executive functions. And with training, we seem to be able to abort that, which means that in, say, in child remand homes, in juvenile centers, if we were to evaluate executive functions, for sure, we will find that the executive functions are low, train the executive functions, and there would be a reduction in, maybe at least we will prevent them from being repeat offenders. Say if we were to do this on first-time offenders, then we would be able to prevent repeat offenders. So how does executive functions develop? When and where? And why should we look at executive functions in children? Unlike other cognitive abilities, two of the core executive functions, which is inhibition and working memory, develops from 7 months of age. So we are really looking at infants. And if we are able to provide the right environment for these individuals, we will be able to even abort some of these severe disorders from presenting. Some of them, not all of them. Just yesterday, I was listening to a talk on one of the psychiatric groups, And the psychiatric professor kept insisting again and again that childhood experiences seem to be crucial for development of a lot of mental health disorders, which is true for also all of our cognitive abilities to develop. So from the age of 7 months, in a right environment, we will be able to foster and improve executive functions in children. And as we move along, we'll talk about various studies which have looked at this. Um, the second thing why we need to look at executive functions in an academic setting is, as the cognitive abilities, like when you look at Piaget's development stages, you can see that the growth spurts that Piaget talks about ties in with the growth spurts of executive functions. Between years, from birth to 1 year, there is a huge leap in certain executive functions. Then again, at the age of 3, you have another spurt where you see similar growth spurts. That's when children enter school. Then again, ages 9 to 11, where they shift from primary school to middle school. And that's where, if you also look at the shift in the academics, suddenly we expect children to be a lot more responsible. We don't dictate notes and we don't do much of spoon feeding. The curriculum changes, the nature of what we expect from them and the nature of the curriculum, the difficulty level increases. I wouldn't say marginally, but it improves to a fair extent because the growth spurts also tie in with executive functions. Our expectations of these children at that stage also improves. So there is a parallel, or one mimics the other. The development of one mimics the development of other. Therefore, for adequate academic functioning and for adequate skills, we need to have an adequate or intact executive functions. Studies have looked at if executive functions are not intact, then what happens? 1 in 10 children seem to have a working memory. WM stands for working memory. We'll see what working memory is all about, and it's one very important, crucial component of executive functions. So 1 in 10 children have lower working memory. The moment we look at neuroatypical children, the moment we look at children with learning disability or ADHD, those numbers increase quite significantly, which means even in neurotypical children, 1 in 10 children have an impairment of some sort on one or the other executive function scale. Therefore, early identification is important for us to identify. And if you look at children who are in the 3 to 5 year group, we don't diagnose them as having, a learning disability, but we may diagnose them as having ADHD, but not learning disability. However, many of them can go into the at-risk category. And some of the school-based programs that I'm going to be talking about later on refer to this group, and they put them in what is known as an at-risk group. They identify them early, provide inputs to improve their executive functions, and then they watch them through school to see what happens to their academic success and what happens to their interpersonal relationships. Very interesting. So what are these executive functions that I've been talking about? We can actually break them up into 3 columns. A core basic requirement for all functioning, for any activity that we do, is attention. So attention is assumed to be a part. It's not an independent, cognitive ability that we're looking at, because if we don't pay attention, then there's nothing that we can do. Attention seems to be a core aspect. From there, then we have the first order executive functions, which are 3 in number: inhibition, mental flexibility, and working memory. Mental flexibility sometimes is also referred to as set shifting or cognitive flexibility, and working memory, which is also of late been referred to as updating. From the first order executive functions, we have a second order executive functions, which are dependent on the first order executive functions, which are decision making, problem solving, and reasoning. Emotional regulation is yet another aspect, and we'll talk about it when we speak of hot and cold cognition. So we'll look at each one of these. But for us to sort of identify quickly what we mean by each of those, how do you know whether there is a problem with inhibition, or there's a problem with mental flexibility, or there's a problem with working memory? If you see a child who has trouble remembering verbal messages, you tell the child, tomorrow this is the last day for you to submit your notebook, and the child forgets to tell his mother at home. Or you give an assignment and the child forgets to write it down in his diary, and therefore assignment is not submitted. And when you don't give marks, then the parents come asking, why has he got a zero in this column? And then you have to say that the assignment was given, he was given 2 weeks and he still has not submitted, right? So trouble remembering verbal messages, not able to remember items on a shopping list, has trouble prioritizing things, what comes first, what comes next. So sequential ordering of things, and particularly trouble with mental calculations. Flexibility refers to be able to come up with different solutions for one problem. Because you're not able to look at things from another person's perspective, you get frustrated and you get angry, and you're not willing to look at or understand an alternate explanation for what is happening, and you tend to blame the person in front of you. Inhibition can show up as not willing to let go of the screen, which is what we see in a lot of ADHDs and a lot of our children. Screen addiction, you switch off the television, they'll pick up your phone. Switch off, take the phone away, they want their tab. You take the tab away, they come back to the television. And this cycle keeps going on and on, because they have trouble letting go, they have trouble letting go of their anger, they have trouble giving up a habit, and they're always in a hurry to finish, and they act without thinking. So they react first and then they reflect. So a difference between reaction and reflection. We'll come back to that again, right? So let's look at each one of these. I'm also looking at these in order, the order in which they are found developmentally, which means inhibition, developmentally, we see that first, then we see working memory, and then finally, we see cognitive flexibility. So inhibition or inhibitory control refers to control of your thoughts, behavior, emotions, and attention, right? So we all have an internal predisposition. We have to control it, even if there is an overriding, potency to react in a particular manner. Control that in the event of an external trigger, and then display something else. What do I mean by this? We see this often with children with ADHD. You tell the child, or the parents often tell their children, you must not hit anybody when you're angry. So this child is sitting quietly in his place and watching, and he sees his friend hitting somebody else, or he sees his friend being hit by somebody else. He doesn't hit. He knows it's wrong to hit. But the moment he sees somebody else hitting his friend, then he takes it upon himself. It's his responsibility to make sure that wrong behavior is not carried out. And therefore, he will then go and retaliate by hitting. So the prepotent response is hitting. He tries to suppress it, but when the provocation, a slightest provocation, the emotions are overriding, and without thinking, without suppressing his thoughts or controlling or applying brakes on his behavior, he would go and hit this other person. And when asked, he will say, well, he hit first. You didn't see him hit, but you're catching me for doing the same thing, right? So because of this inability to control our thoughts or actions or behavior or emotions, we're unable to make the right choices. And therefore, and because we have this, that we are able to choose our reactions, we choose the same reactions, it becomes a prepotent response because it becomes a habit. So we do the same thing over and over again, and that's how a habit is formed. If we understand that there is inhibitory control, then the habit can be suppressed and a new habit can be, or an old habit can be replaced by a newer action because of inhibitory control. So let me explain that in the context of, let's say, smoking. Smoking is a habit that we develop over a period of time. And if I want to give it up, I can only give it up if inhibition is possible. When I go to a party, my friends are smoking. How do I say no to them? I can smell the cigarettes. They're all, even though they've gone out to the balcony to smoke, I can still smell it. And the cues are, everybody's talking, we're having a good time. Some of them are smoking. The cues are there everywhere. It's there in the social milieu, it's there in the smell, it's there in the situation that demands it. But I still will be able to suppress that temptation only because of inhibitory control. All right. And there is something which is known as selective attention, which is that we choose to pay attention. So in the same example, we choose to pay attention to, all right, I've promised my mother that I'm not going to smoke today. And therefore, no matter what provocation there is, I am going to selectively attend to only that one thought, and I'm not going to smoke. So selective attention helps us to maintain this inhibitory control. There are two kinds of selective attention. I won't take too much time talking about it. You have something which is known as a top-down, and then you have a bottom-up. Top-down, the bottom-up happens where there are multiple things happening. Like, for example, now I'm talking, you're listening to my talk. It may be raining outside. There may be a power cut. Maybe, your child wants to sleep, and then your husband is watching TV. So there are multiple things that are happening. Even though there are multiple things happening, your selective attention is only towards the lecture. Should something happen outside that requires your attention, then the focus of your attention will expand to include other things. But until such time it doesn't demand your attention is going to be focused on something very small, right? Similarly, in a party, there are multiple groups of people who are talking. You are not even aware that these people are talking because you're so involved in a conversation. The moment somebody else mentions your name, you immediately turn to them and you respond to that, and then you get back to this group. That is possible because of this exogenous attention, where you're focused only on one thing that's happening and you blot out everything else. But should there be a need, you quickly switch and then you come back and continue what you're doing. That is exogenous attention. Endogenous attention, on the other hand, I know that my sister is getting engaged tomorrow and guests are arriving, but I also have a test on Monday. Therefore, I'm going to sit and finish studying today. Let the guests come. I can still have my fun tomorrow if I finish studying today. That's my goal. So I sit and I finish studying today. I have a wide range of actions to choose from. I can finish the engagement party early tomorrow, 2 days before the guests start arriving. I have a wide range of things, and then I narrow it down and bring it to, all right, I'm going to make maximum use of today so that tomorrow I can enjoy my cousin's engagement, right? So that is referred to as an endogenous or a top-down attention, where from a wide range, you choose and you focus on one thing. Two different kinds of selective attention. Then there is something which is known as cognitive inhibition. So you have selective attention, which helps in inhibitory control. And then you have something which is known as an interference control or inhibition. That is where you have various other learnings that come in the way. So something that you've learned before interferes with what you're learning now. For example, if I'm learning Sanskrit and I'm trying to learn German, then when I'm trying to learn German, if Sanskrit interferes, that is one kind, which is known as a proactive interference. And after having learned German most recently, I go back to read something in Sanskrit, then German interferes with Sanskrit, that becomes retroactive interference. So to be able to ignore that and say, hang on, that rule in grammar is true of German, not in Sanskrit, and this is what I will do in Sanskrit. But when I'm doing German, I have to ignore the rules of grammar that are there, that apply in Sanskrit, and use what applies in German. So the ability to switch from one to the other is again possible only because of this cognitive inhibition, right? And then there is something known as self-control, which becomes very important in terms of self-regulation. So it shows up in times like where you have invited a child or a group of children for a birthday party. They're all there, and then you see a beautiful cake. The cake is kept on the table. What will all the small children do? All of them will walk up to the cake, and they're all admiring it. And then there will be that one child who will quietly go and poke his finger onto the cream to see, does the rose look good? It's too tempting. I want it, but I have to wait till the cake is being cut. And then he will go and touch it. And then his finger mark will be, then he quickly run away from there because he doesn't want to be caught. So self-control, immediate need for gratification versus delayed gratification. Delayed gratification is possible only because of something known as self-control or inhibition. When we see a breakdown in this delayed gratification, like you tell your child, the example that I gave you earlier about going out for lunch, today is not possible because it's raining. Let's look at going out next weekend because it will be a long weekend and we can all enjoy, and hopefully the rain would have subsided by then. That delay in gratification, when that is not possible and the child throws a big tantrum, and then you may have to compensate by maybe buying at least a box of ice cream to pacify this child, that's when you're looking at a break in the inhibitory control, right? Moving, how do we, what are some of the things that we do as action or behavior to indicate poor inhibitory control? Many a times we hit the send button, may not just be a mail, it may be a message also, and that regretted later, blurting out the first thing that comes to our mind, jumping to conclusions after listening to just a few facts, and jumping to erroneous conclusions, right? What are some of the tests? You have Stroop. I'm sure many of you have seen this on the internet. There's umpteen examples I was going to show you, but I thought you guys may be familiar with it. Stroop is a simple test. It has 3 trials to it, where one trial you just read words printed in black ink against a white background. The names of colors, 3 colors, red, blue, and green. The second trial consists of you being able to name the color of the ink in which 3 X's are written. Again, on a white background, the X's are written in either red, blue, or green, and you just have to name the color of the ink. So in the first trial, you read the word. In the second trial, you name the color of the ink. In the third trial, against a white background, you have columns of words, again, written in now colored ink. So, but the problem is in this trial, the word spelt does not match the color of the ink in which it is written, which means the word blue may be written in green ink, the word red may be written in blue ink, and the word green may be written in red ink. So the instructions are that you have to name the color and not read the word. So the aspect that we're assessing here is, can our automatic response is to read a word the moment we see it? Can we suppress our ability to read a word and instead name the ink in which it is written? That's what this test measures. And the moment there is poor inhibitory control, time taken increases and the number of errors increase. On the third trial, for some children, second trial also they struggle. And many of them, there is a huge discrepancy between trial 1 and trial 3 in terms of time and errors. And that's what the test measures. Flanker again looks at, you have an arrow in the middle pointing, let's say it's pointing towards the left. And then you have arrows on either side of this middle arrow. You have to say whether the arrow in the middle matches the arrows on the either side. Then as you move along, you stop focusing on the middle and you focus on what are on either side and say, do the arrows on the outside match the arrow in the middle? And then you have to say yes or no. So once you're used to doing one, your ability to ignore that and focus on something that's happening, the other thing that's happening. Go, no go, again, is a very important paradigm. These can be tests and these can be tasks as well, where you have a signal and you react to a signal in a particular way. And then when you're about to react, you see something else and then you have to stop. Simple thing is signals. That's the best example I can give you. Traffic signals. Green light means go, red light means stop, Then there is the amber light. Now, when the amber light comes, you're supposed to stop or make attempts to stop whatever you're doing. Either get ready to move if you have stopped, or get ready to stop if you're moving, right? So the go, no go, and the signal that comes is like this. Go is green, no go is red. When you're about to go, if you see amber, then you're supposed to not go, which is what the amber is for. That's what a no go paradigm is. When you're about to give a response, there is a signal which will make you stop, even if you have started reacting and making preparations to react in a particular way. So these are ways of by which you can assess inhibition, right? um, this is an interesting research that was done. They followed children from the age of 3 up to the age of 40. So, it was really about spanning over 30, 37 or 36 years. They assessed children for executive functions, particularly inhibition. And what they found was the children who were better on executive functions were able to stay in school longer, because it's, in the West, school dropouts are fairly common there, and it's an accepted procedure where you complete a certain level and thereafter then you stop. um, Unlike with us, where we expect our children to go up to a graduation. So children with higher executive functions tend to stay in school longer. They are less likely to make risky choices. They seem to have better physical and mental health. Occupational functioning seems to be better. And overall, they seem to be more law-abiding citizens. So the flip side is the one with lower executive functions seem to have a negative aspect. They drop out of school early, make risky choices, chances of addiction, or taking on, things which are antisocial are much higher in that group. The second executive function is that of working memory. So is like our RAM. It's our capacity to hold on to information. Simple thing is when I say 2 plus 3 plus 9 plus 4. Can you give me the answer quickly? So you're holding on to 2 plus 3, which is 5, plus I'm saying 9 plus 4, which is 13, and then you put the two together and say 18. For you to be able to do this online while maybe you're doing multiple other things, you require working memory. There are two kinds of two kinds of working memory: verbal working memory and visuospatial working memory. Many a times in math disorder, you see that only visuospatial working memory is affected, whereas with reading, only verbal working memory is affected. Whereas some studies have said that you cannot see much of a difference between the two, but some studies very clearly have said math, visuospatial working memory, and reading is verbal working memory. Working memory is really crucial for a lot of things. When you find a child reads and then is not able to comprehend the text, often we assume that comprehension is impaired, right? Or when I give instructions, this child does the opposite, and therefore maybe there is a problem in the child's comprehension. But what if that was because the child is not able to hold on to the multiple bits of information? That then is not a problem in comprehension, but a problem in working memory. So many times when reading comprehension is impaired, or when the child has trouble following multiple instructions, or converting oral instructions or written instructions into action, we should be looking at working memory, because working memory is required for converting verbal or oral instructions into action, is required for organizing things in a timely sequence, is required for us to be able to relate to things. So, this is what the science experiment I read about said, and I'm seeing that in real life, to be able to relate to what I'm reading in a book and what I'm actually seeing in real life. For all of this, we need working memory. So here are some of the things where working memory is required: mental maths, to redo or reorder a list, translating instructions into action, incorporating new. So I'm doing something. While I'm doing this, my mother says, why don't you consider adding this also onto the shopping list? for me to be able to update my information. And that's why working memory also currently is being referred to as updating, that I have to update and incorporate this also into my schedule to be able to see a connection between the two. Oh, yesterday I learned subtraction and today I'm learning division. So just like how multiplication is a serial addition, is division also a serial subtraction? Can I make that connection on my own, right? And that's possible only because of working memory. With good levels of working memory, obviously, the individual tends to be a lot more creative. All right, the connection between working memory and inhibition, we can see on two the card sorting test, dimension card sorting test for younger children between the ages of 3 and 5. And then you have the Wisconsin card sorting test, which is a classic test of both working memory and mental flexibility, where you're given a stimulus, let's say a truck, a red truck. So for children, when you show them a truck, they only see a truck. But if you say this is a red object, then they only see the color. So the truckness of the red object will disappear when they focus on the color, and the redness of the truck will disappear when they focus on the truck. They can only see one dimension, right? So when you give a child, let's say, you give a set of cards and say, sort this according to whether it's a truck or a star, then the child would be able to do that correctly. The next time round, you ask the child to sort the same cards on whether it's a blue object or a red object. Then you will see a lot of errors because they're not able to see the blueness or the redness of a truck or a star. Regardless of whether you start with the color first or the shape first, we see errors in the second trial. The same thing happens with the Wisconsin card sorting test. And that is because we're not able, we know the rules, we know that the rules have changed, we are able to remember it. So working memory, is possible, but I'm not able to inhibit my response. So, we just speaking about inhibitory control. So the two are very, related to each other. And how does this translate to, say, a child's behavior in class? I know the rule is that I should not speak out of turn and I must raise my hand. You ask me and I'll tell you the rule. But when the teacher asks the question, I'm not able to hold on to the rule and realize I must not speak. Instead, I'll raise my hand, but I will blurt out the answer also. That happens because working memory and inhibitory control, either they're weak or they're competing for space. This being limited resource, they compete for, the space on the RAM in the brain. And therefore, tasks that improve working memory, you will see, will also improve inhibition, largely because the two are interrelated. How do we assess working memory? Digit span forward. So I present a series of digits starting from 2 up to 8 digits of numbers, and the child is supposed to repeat it forward. And then again, 2 digits to 8 digits, the child is supposed to repeat it backward. So digit forward and digit backward, verbal working memory. The block tapping test is a visuospatial working memory, very similar to digit span, and you also have self-ordered pointing. Mental flexibility is the third executive function, which is a capacity to switch between two alternatives. So it could be an action, it could be emotion, it could be a perspective, right? And it develops much later than working memory and inhibition, and it requires thinking out of the box, and therefore it has to do with creativity. Just to give you an example of how this can present in day-to-day life, while Vijay and I were coordinating for this talk, I think Vijay reached out to me maybe 3 months ago and set a date for this webinar. And at that time, I knew I would forget, and I had requested her to remind me. And at frequent intervals, she kept sending me reminders. Unfortunately, I think a couple of weeks before, I had the same talk that another organization reached out for, and they organized for the same topic, right? They approached me after I had agreed to do this talk with Vijaya some time ago, but their talk came before this one. Because it was only recent, about 3 weeks ago, I think last week, Vijay shot out a message to me saying, how different is your talk going to be compared to this one? And she shared me a a photo of the poster of that talk, right? Now, when I saw that, and I'm really grateful that she sent me that poster earlier, because I had forgotten that the topics are the same, working memory, right? Because she sent that, now, how do I interpret that question? Why is she questioning what I'm going to do? Can be one reaction, right? Have all the people who are going to be present today attended my previous talk? Then what am I going to do? None of my jokes will work because they've already listened to my jokes in that session. What am I going to do? Panic can be another reaction. Then I don't care. I don't have time to make new slides. So I'm going to use the same ones. And if they don't laugh for my joke, well, anyway, it's online. Who cares? Can be another reaction, right? Or I can take this as an opportunity and say, well, thankfully, she gave me 1 week time. Let me read up and upgrade my knowledge and make this a different presentation and see how I can make the same topic, but take a different approach, right? That would indicate mental flexibility. But for somebody who say has anxiety, that question could be a trigger to say, oh my God, I'm so nervous. Maybe they have attended the previous talk. What if they don't enjoy my talk? What happens if I make a mistake? What happens if this new topic I don't have enough time to read? Anxiety. If I'm prone to depression, this could have been a trigger for me to have negative thoughts and say, I'm never good. No matter what I do, people are never satisfied with me. And that then would be the cause for me to be depressed. If I'm paranoid, schizophrenic, then why are these people following me everywhere I give a talk? Why can't they do that to other people? Then, they're after me, and then I get paranoid. So depending on my genetic load, my executive functions will bring forward these symptoms based on this one stressful situation. If intact executive functions, and I'm hoping I'm displaying intact, mental flexibility, then my talk hopefully will be different, even though the slides may be similar, but the content and the way I've approached it can be different. So I had a plan A that went for a toss because Vijay asked me that question. Then I had a plan B, and then the plan B didn't fit very well. And then I came up with a plan C. And that is what is mental flexibility all about. Requires to change your perspective, to admit that you were wrong. Yeah, maybe I was lazy. I was going to use the same slides because she asked me, I changed my slides. All right. Admit that you were wrong, adjust to the changing demands, and then you take advantage of this situation and see how you can improvise on it, and therefore creativity. Mental flexibility allows us to do all of this, but for which we need intact working memory and inhibition, because inhibition will say all the extra noise. Okay, oh, she doesn't like me, she wants to give me more work, so what if these people don't like my talk? That is noise. I have to inhibit all of that, and then to be able to look at what I can do differently this time to be able to cater to the demand of this particular activity. So these are formal tests, verbal and category fluency, where either you choose, if time permits, maybe I can let you do this task and we'll see how it works. A particular letter is given, and then you're supposed to generate as many words as possible within a time limit from starting from that letter. Or you have a category fluency, like say, tell me all the animals that you know within a specified time. So time is crucial here. Wisconsin card sorting test. So you have cards which are presented, which have, I think, 4 colors, 4 shapes, and 3 numbers, or 4 numbers again. They differ on the basis of shape, color, and number. So I may have diamonds, clover, and something else. I can't remember now. Triangles, I think, and stars. Yes, 4 shapes, and then 4 colors: green, blue, yellow, and red. And then you also have numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you can, the examiner has a predetermined set of rules. Maybe you need to match all the card on the basis of color. So I have a stimulus card that's placed on the table, and then the person goes on sorting the cards. And every time the person, let's say, all the cards are, a set of cards are placed face up on the table, and then you have a deck of cards and you have to sort them according to a rule. When you start placing the cards, supposing you match them for color, and if my rule is shape, I will only say it matches or yes or no. If I say no, then you must try and guess what the rule is and continue sorting unless you get a yes from me. Based on my yes, you will try and guess the rule. Without warning, the rule will change. So you, supposing, finally you figure I have thought of number and you sort on the basis of number. After a certain number of trials, I will change the rule in my mind as an examiner to color. Then how many trials do you take to figure out that the rule has changed, and then you adapt to that. And after you change, I will once again change it to shape. So this keeps happening to a certain number of trials, and the time taken and the number of errors and the number of trials you need to figure out that the rule has changed is what this test is all about. And then you have trail making test and color trails, which are often used to measure mental flexibility. So just to give you a sense of how these various components come together, you have working memory, which helps you maintain the rules and keep the goal in mind. And both internal and external distractions are suppressed with the help of inhibition or inhibitory control. You have three kinds of attention. You have response inhibition, selective attention, and cognitive inhibition, which works towards self-regulation. It could be regulation of emotions as well. That then, combined with mental flexibility, helps in the lower order cognitive or executive functions, or cognitive control as it's called. Lower order executive functions together then help build higher order executive functions, which is reasoning, planning, and problem solving. So all of these together are called as executive functions. Working memory, inhibitory control, mental flexibility, just the three of them also refer to as cognitive control. Once you have the higher order and the lower order all in place, you can have evidence of fluid intelligence. So when we assess intelligence, there are two kinds of intelligence. A crystallized intelligence is the biological intelligence, is the intelligence that you're born with. But the fluid intelligence is something that you use by, because of the experiences that you've had, the exposure that you've had, all that you acquire as you go along. And that can keep changing as you go along. So because working memory can be flexible, can be changing, it impacts your fluid intelligence. So often when we go through a training program for a child, and you assess their IQ before and after, sometimes the IQ can change after. Most likely we are looking at changes in the fluid intelligence, and that can be influenced because the executive function changes, right? Just to tell you a little bit about hot and cold cognition. So just like the word implies, cold cognition is something that you test in a lab, which has to do with only at the thought level. It is mediated by the prefrontal, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex, right? And that's what the executive functions would look at. But there is something which is referred to as hot cognition, which can also be assessed, but that is controlled more by the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate regions in the brain. This refers to emotions. So if you go back to, either we talk about ADHD and why he picks up a bat to hit his friend, hit the boy who bullied his friend, or, the interaction between me and Vidya. If I react with anger and say, how dare she question me? Then my hot cognitions will hijack the neural system to a point where logic will fail me and I will react emotionally. On the other hand, given time, I say, okay, I'm not going to react to Vijay's message immediately. I will wait for some time. Then my hot cognitions will cool off, and then the cold cognition takes over, and I'm able to logically reason out why she could have questioned, ask that question, and then act accordingly. So hot and cold cognition, most often when we assess, we primarily assess cold cognition in the lab, and it refers to thoughts. On the other hand, we also can have something which can create problems in a day-to-day life. So In ADHD, sometimes this is the problem, that when you ask them what you're supposed to do, the cold cognition being intact, they will tell you this is what I'm supposed to do. But the neural system of the hot cognition hijacks the cold cognition, preventing them from carrying out an actual action on the basis of what is required. Later, if you ask them to think about it, then they will be able to come up with a correct answer. Therefore, if we understand that the hot cognition is hijacking the cold cognition and suppressing it, preventing it from showing, what we need is to give them some time. So, if you tell the ADHD, I know you're angry now, don't react immediately. Just think about what you have to do, and then you tell me your answer. Most likely, they will give you the right answer, right? That is how we look at or evaluate hot and cold cognition, right? Okay. So, what are some of the things that can look at interfering with executive functions? Stress, depression, or negative or sad feelings, loneliness, physical ill health, lack of exercise, very important, and sleep deprivation. The reason why I thought this was important to share is currently many of the children that you might be seeing, last two are true. They lack physical exercise, and because they're on screens, they are having poor quality sleep. I know a lot of older adolescents are waking up late or staying up late in order to maybe interact with their friends, or they're on online gaming, or they're on social media much later into the night, because they know they can sleep up to 8 o'clock. 8:15 is class, 8 o'clock I wake up is enough, and so they sleep by 1 or 2. So lack of exercise and sleep deprivation can negatively and quite significantly negatively impact executive functions, right? And they can hijack the prefrontal cortex quite significantly. So if you're finding that when children start coming back to school, once school reopens, if you find that their attention is a problem, their impulse control is a problem, largely because of lack of exercise and sleep deprivation. Okay. So formal identification, I've already spoken to you about many of these tests. So there are 3 ways in which professionally, when you bring them to a clinical psychologist, we would look at the observations of the parents and teachers, and also clinically we observe the child in our session. Then we may have rating scales with the child. If the child can rate himself or herself, we give them a self-rating scale. Otherwise, we collect rating scales from parents and from teachers. And then there are formal tests that we would use. And this is how a typical assessment would look like. So if you look at this child, the 2 children, this is just a hypothetical case. You can see this child in pink, the working memory is much lower. 90 to 110 on this test is considered to be average, and 111 upwards is high average. So if you look at the full scale IQ, both the children are in the high average range. But this child, ASV, has low working memory. And when we look at what happens on the neuropsychological profile, you can see ASV clearly: verbal fluency, mental flexibility, inhibition, working memory, all that we have discussed as executive functions, this child has a problem with. PWR, on the other hand, had intact most of the other skills on the IQ scale, therefore probably quite well preserved. But you can see memory, these are percentiles. So anything below 20 is a problem. So this child, memory is in the average range, while most of the other things are in the superior range. That can cause some problems, but inhibition seems to be the lowest with this child. So we can expect only maybe emotional outbursts with PWR, but with ASP, you can see that the child probably will also be struggling in school. And most likely, this child, if you were to look at academic functions, would also have either ADHD or learning disability or both. So most often, we look at the profile to be able to estimate the severity of the problem. We look at cognitive functions, we look at intellectual functions, and we look at academic functions. And based on that, then we arrive at a diagnosis. These are the three ranges that we can get. A, child has problems across all the tests that we have, and therefore can quite likely have both ADHD and learning disability. The moment we have two diagnoses, more than 95% sure that they will have quite significant executive function deficits. Two, that they may have a few selective executive function deficits, and therefore only selective problems, either a learning disorder or ADHD, and that too mild to borderline. And then a third category where they have no ADHD or no learning disability, but they can have significant variations in their executive functions, like we see with PWR, all in the average range, but some are very superior and some are in the average range. So in comparison, the difference between a 90th percentile and a 50th percentile or a 40th percentile can be at least one standard deviation different. Statistically, that is a huge difference. And the chances are that this child may not be affected till he finishes 10th standard, may not even be affected till he finishes grade 11 or 12. But thereafter, this can act as a problem. And therefore, we then work on this child and say, because he has selective impairments only in this, there may be no diagnosis pinned on him, but you train the executive functions in a short span of maybe 3 months. This child, the functioning can be improved quite significantly. And we can see huge jumps in the fluid intelligence score of the child. ASV, on the other hand, might need a longer intervention program because the range of deficits are wider. So the more severe the deficits, the larger the range of deficits, the longer the child might need to be in intervention. Lesser the deficits, shorter program is required. So what do we do after we identify that the child has a problem? Most often, we offer a cognitive training program. On what basis do we have this, training program? Is largely because of what is known as neural plasticity in the brain. The brain has an inherent capacity for spontaneous recovery, right? So if there is, let's say, a head injury or there is some kind of an infection that happens, maybe some neurons, have been affected because of that. The brain has the capacity for spontaneous recovery. So either it will circumvent that or generate a new neuron. Priority will be given to certain functions. So language functions will be the first to recover. So inherently, the brain is plastic in nature. And because of this plasticity, there is a process of recovery after an injury. Even if there is no injury, maybe, there's no infection like in a developmental disorder, then through learning, through exposure, the brain has the capacity to profit from that, largely because of its plasticity. So either the damaged functions can be recovered or by stimulating the brain, or we can look at generating networks and strengthening the process as in developmental disorders, right? So the brain responds to the external stimulation, and either if the stimulation is strong and happens repeatedly like we do in an intervention program, or even day-to-day experiences. So if the experience, like if my talk is boring today, you're not going to gain anything out of this. But if you feel that, okay, I learned a lot today and this was a very sort of, inspiring talk, then that one talk, that one exposure is enough to influence the way you look at things. And, you would look at things very differently after that. So one exposure is enough because the brain is plastic and will respond to it for intact brains. But in damaged brains, the inputs have to be very specific, and they have to, there has to be a certain intensity at which it works. How does this work? There are neural networks. These networks control specific functions. If you are aware of that, you can target those functions. The moment you target them by giving them exercises repeatedly, they will start firing. So the adage is, cells that fire together will wire together, which means the moment there is an electrical impulse generated in all the cells in that circuit will be complete and the neurons will be generated. Much like you have seeds sprouting, neurons will sprout these axons and dendrons, and that's how the circuitry is completed. For that to happen, activities have to be presented repeatedly in increasing order of difficulty over a period of time for us to have these circuits to be formed. And specific networks have to be targeted, and the brain will respond to this by completing those connections. So there is a functional change in the brain in response to training programs, and this has been proved using the functional imaging techniques, the fMRI. There are two models. One model says, like I said, attention, and then I will look at first order executive functions and then second order executive functions. Another model says, I will not look at attention at all, but I will start with higher order executive functions and then come down to the first order executive functions, and finally a little bit of work on attention. Because I focus on the higher order executive functions, attention should get better automatically. But my experience has been a mixed model where we switch back and forth. Who will benefit from this? People who have had brain injury or a lesion or infection. So seizures, like I said, depression, OCD, anxiety, schizophrenia, all of these people right now, the world over, with people are talking about cognitive training. We're looking at developmental disorders where there's no injury or no lesion. So an MRI will not show anything, but we know that the functioning of the brain needs to be altered. Such people will benefit from a cognitive training program. And like I already said, many of these psychiatric disorders, even if they're not diagnosable disorders, somebody comes and tells you, I'm always angry all the time, or I'm stressed. Can you help me with that? Therapy can be one way of doing it. CBT is a very potent aspect, but without doing any of that, just improving executive functions is enough to reduce these symptoms. So what are some of the functions that are trained in a cognitive training program, or CRT or CT as it's referred to? Attention, definitely. Executive functions, which is working memory, mental flexibility, inhibition, verbal fluency, and problem solving. And some of them, like say in dementia, for example, memory would also be required. But when we work on ADHD and learning disability, we only work with executive functions. So we use a combination of different tasks. Tasks are presented at an increasing level of difficulty. And then once their targets are set every session, once the child reaches the same target consistently across 3 sessions and with 80% or 85% accuracy, then we move to the next level of difficulty, right? So we have maybe 5 or 6 levels for each task, each activity, which covers all of these cognitive abilities. So we have about 15 to 30 activities that we can use for these children across 5 to 6 levels of difficulty. When a child has reached maybe between 5 and 6 levels for all of the activities, then we terminate the program. Okay. So what we know currently is that executive functions for anybody with or without a diagnosis can be improved across age groups. Young children, preschool children, right up to elderly, 80-year-old, 90-year-old, executive functions can be improved. Children who are most behind, they are the ones who definitely need it as far as executive functions are concerned. The earlier we provide it, the better, because then they will be able to quickly catch up with their peers and level the playing field. This has significant impact and transfer to academic as well as social emotional functioning. Improving executive functions, training executive functions will improve executive functions. Executive functions improved, therefore social and other behaviors also improve. So there is that transfer to day-to-day life. Repeated practice is the key. For the circuits to be completed, the program has to be done over a period of time. The child must experience fatigue. Often children tell us, oh, I got a headache yesterday. For us, that is good news, though we don't tell them that, right? Because they experience fatigue, that's why they get the headache. When they reach that stage, that's when we get good results. The task demand, you have to keep monitoring it. And if you keep increasing the difficulty level, that's when they quickly reach the maximum benefit of the program. So just to quickly give you an idea of 2 programs which are curriculum based, which means that like this program, the paths, for example, was done where they focus on self-control, understanding what emotions are, which they call as emotional literacy, providing social competence in a social situation. How do they interact with peers, which then translates to peer positive or better improved peer relations, and problem solving skills. So the whole program was broken into small bits depending on the age of the child and the class in which the child was studying. And the teachers were trained over a 3-month program to provide this 2 or 3 days in a week. And the whole school got this for the whole school year, and they could see significant changes in the executive functions. The CSR program looked at providing similar kind of inputs by training the teachers of children who go to an who belong to an underprivileged section of society, where executive functions are known to be very low. So in these children who belong to lower socioeconomic status, where school dropouts and low executive functions were known, because of which the teachers were constantly dealing with behavior problems and disruptive behaviors in a class. Teachers were trained to identify it, to associate it with executive functions, and then they were taught how to manage this in a classroom situation. Additionally, they were also provided with mental health consultation, both for themselves as well as for the children. So there was a tie-up, and the teacher could always refer if they felt they tried something at a classroom level and that was not working. The child could be referred to a mental health professional. When such a thing was done, the teachers were better equipped to handle disruption in the class. So instead of constantly dealing with disruptions in the classroom and the academic part of it taking a toss, they were able to deal with it and abort it before it actually started because of this training. And therefore, the children improved their executive functions, and that improved mental health, that improved their academic functions, and improved their cognitive skills. Right? CogMed, this is something different from the other two, both PATHS and CSRP, where this is focused only on improving working memory, attention, and inhibition. They started off working only with ADHD, but now they've extended their work to LD also. Some of you might have heard it's in India as well. This is a combination of both cognitive neuroscience as well as computer game design. So it's a computerized program. 5 days a week, 1 hour a day, 3 to 5 weeks training, and they report significant changes and complete reduction in ADHD. We have also been doing a similar program for both. We started with working only with learning disability, and we started with adolescents. Then we extended it to children below the age of, between the ages of 3. Right now, we are also working with young adults and adults. And then we started including ADHD and also children on the spectrum. Unfortunately, the program doesn't do exceptionally well for children with autism or children who are non-verbal with autism. But children on the spectrum definitely do very well with our program. And in the during the lockdown, we were forced to sort of go into a digital version. And now this program is available not just for people with a learning disability or ADHD, but anybody who wants to improve their cognitive training. It's available for download, and I've just given you that link on the Google Play Store. This is how it looks. This is a very sort of rundown version, but we are coming up with a newer version. Maybe in a couple of weeks, we are hoping to go online, and maybe you can look at downloading it next month. But you're happy, even the way it is now, if used properly, it has a lot of benefits and it covers all the base executive functions. So what can you do to improve executive functions? One, it's okay to say no to a child. It's okay for your child to have a negative reaction to that, but allow that child to hear the no and help the child to tolerate it, right? That obviously inhibition, working memory, and mental flexibility will improve. Then use a lot of activities, like we used to say, I don't know if you remember, we used to play mud or stone, or jumping from land to sea. And when you're about to jump, if you see a crocodile, then you don't jump into the sea. Even though the action says jump, but you don't jump into the sea because there is a crocodile. So go, no go, simple games like that you can play with your child. And then adding a delay component, right? So I remember when we had a workshop with Adele Diamond, she was saying something which I thought was really useful, that when a child has mirror imaging, let's say B and D, the child is using a regular pencil to write, and you place a red color pencil next to your child. And when the child is about to write a letter that you think the child has a mirror image for, ask him to stop, put the pencil down, what he's using, pick up the red pencil, and then write that letter that he has to write. So what that does is adds a delay component. So it allows the inhibitory control to kick in, and then the rule of, okay, B goes from left to right and D goes from right to left. So the capacity to allow the child to rehearse that rule, and then the child writes with the red pen and then puts it down. So once that happens, that's an effortful processing, allows the executive functions to come into play, and that gives you a chance to switch also. So delay component helps in working through some of these. Physical exercise, just 20 minutes of moderate level exercise improves executive function significantly, whether the child has ADHD or learning disability. Physical exercise, different kinds of exercise, of course, there is enough research to say all of these have an impact, be it aerobics, be it yoga, be it mindful meditation or martial arts. All of them have found to be beneficial. And also to withhold an emotional reaction on a day-to-day basis. How are you feeling on a day-to-day basis? Let's look at, okay, what you were watching TV, write down what emotions you were experiencing. You were playing football, write down what. So they tend to focus on their emotions and they become more aware, which then builds regulation and inhibitory control. Whatever they are doing, if they have trouble with instructions, help them to break it down into smaller bits and keep repeating or revising them. Use star charts. And I use this quite significantly to help them regulate their emotions. A child who gets angry just because he hears a no, put the star chart there. All you have to do is a smiley face or a sad face, and let the child draw the smiley face or the sad face on himself or herself after the tantrum is over. That allows the child, that gives feedback to the child to say, today you've had a sad face so many times in the day. Tomorrow, can we reduce the number of sad faces and increase the number of happy faces? So without any maybe negative reinforcement, just the fact that the child has a visual count of how many times he had a tantrum today, maybe he aims to control that tantrum the next day, will help build up the inhibitory control. So I was hoping we might have some time for me to play an activity with you, but then I'm happy to stop here and take questions. And then if time permits, maybe we could also have that activity. I hope I haven't overshot the time.
No, you are perfectly on time, Akila.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. If any of you have any questions, please do ask.
Can I go?
Sure, is it Shalini? Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Akila. I mean, this was totally enlightening for me. I just knew what executive function means, but this is so enlightening, and I have so many questions. But I'll keep it brief. I've heard of neuroplasticity. I wonder, why doesn't it say neuroelasticity? Because elasticity is where you can stretch. Plastic does not really stretch. So I always wondered, why is it elastic? Why is it plastic and not elastic?
Good question. Elasticity means you stretch it and then there is a chance of it shrinking back. But plasticity refers to it expanding in response. It's a controlled expansion in response to specific stimuli. And then it remains. So it's a permanent change.
Okay.
So it's not unlike in elastic where it can come back. This is a permanent change and it remains. So supposing now you said you didn't know about executive functions and you've learned. Now your brain has changed for good. And that remains, and the next time you read something about executive functions, you will build on what you've learned today. That's why, they refer to it as plasticity.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And one more question. So you mentioned the cognitive training.
Mhm.
So, and you said it happens over a period of time.
Yes.
So for example, if somebody is trying to overcome their urge to smoke, they're giving up, they're trying to quit smoking. You do this cognitive training for a period of time, and you mentioned that it's plastic, it stays, but there could still be factors that could bring it back, people into their comfort zone, which was of, when the right environmental factors are there, they switch back to their, maybe smoking.
Yes.
So here, I mean, again, I think that executive functions are very, like you said, fluid. You can build them, but depending on the nurture part of it or the environmental part of it, do you think there is a likelihood of these executive functions again reverting back, given that you said they are plastic as well?
Yes, very good question, Shalini. So when we look at addiction, there are frequent relapses. So anybody working in the field of addiction, and smoking would fall into that domain, we know that there are frequent relapses. And so the training of executive functions, the aim at that point is to reduce the gap between the relapses, 1. 2 is to reduce the period for which the addiction extends. So earlier, maybe the addiction, the individual would have for maybe go from 2 cigarettes up to 40 cigarettes a day. But now you look at when it goes to 1 pack a day, they immediately seek help. So that is in terms of severity. And then the duration for which it lasts, that also reduces after the executive function training. And finally, they catch themselves slipping into an addiction, which would not have happened if the executive functions were not trained. So the family members would bring them in at that point. Whereas here, the chances of them coming to you and say, look, I think I've slipped and I need, a quick booster session, the chances of that happening are much higher. So there are improvements in multiple levels. Unlike, say, with ADHD or say with depression, even with depression, that's what we do. Because it has a tendency to be a cyclical nature, we preemptively, we tell them that there might be, repeat episodes, but catch it early and then come in quickly so that we can work on it and prevent it from becoming a serious episode or a severe episode.
Yeah, perfect. That makes sense. Last question. Can you develop executive functions in kids or children with intellectual disabilities?
Yes. Yes. It's much, much slower, but it is possible. And many a times we've had children who are probably in the 5th percentile on despite that, we help them to complete school, go on to complete maybe a graduation. And I know many of them are even working and sustaining their jobs, despite the fact that they have intellectual disability, but they maintain within a particular range and they're able to execute whatever is expected of them in their at their workplace, because they have intact executive functions at that point. Although it's lower, but within that gamut, they're able to function largely because the executive functions are in tune with their cognitive ability.
Okay, I lied. I have one more question. Cognition versus executive functions, because in the beginning you mentioned that if the executive functions are weak, then it affects the cognitive ability, right? But when you were talking about the hot and cold cognition, you said, you mentioned that the neural system takes over, hijacks the cold cognition,
yes,
and basically makes them react as part of their hot cognition, which means that at this point, the executive functions are actually being driven by the cognition. So what I'm getting is that it's kind of a chicken and egg. One leads to another, right? Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, more than one leads to another. They all have to be, in sync. It's like a Somebody was explaining this to me the other day, and they said it's like the tarazu. I forget the English word for that. The weighing scale,
Balance.
like the weighing scale, right?
Balance.
So the balance, one tips over, in one direction, then that takes over, that hijacks the system. So we are constantly having to, and that happens to us on a day-to-day basis as well. It doesn't necessarily have to happen when there is a deficit. So when my emotions take over, logic does not have a place. But if I allow logic, then my emotions can be contained, over a certain period of time. So unfortunately, when say in anger management, anger precedes and it hijacks the neural system completely. So the training for anger management would be to allow the cold cognition to take over and to suppress the hot cognition. Otherwise, a neural hijack will happen all the time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions? I'm not sure who that is.
Narayanan. Sorry, compression. I believe this is Surya Narayanan.
Yes, yes.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, now I can. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I could not join this webinar earlier due to some other compulsions. I believe this webinar is recorded so that I can replay that one to go through that from the beginning, what I missed that particular thing, the beginning.
We will get back to you on that, sir.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Just one more question. Probably you would have covered in the beginning, which I missed it. A child with ADD who is becoming very, very manipulative and manage whatever we do. This particular learning, what you mentioned, will it help that type of child to make sure that the value system is given importance rather than becoming very manipulative?
Yes, it definitely makes a big difference. They become manipulative because it starts off as a simple habit to avoid punishment. And from there, then, because they know they can get away with it, it becomes a habit. And that then they use it exclusively because it's easier for them and it's beneficial for them. With the training, they can be helped to see that this habit comes at a cost. And by improving their inhibitory control and regulating their working memory and mental flexibility, newer habits are formed. So this happens many times with a lot of children, and various kinds of habits we've been able to help them overcome. Lying and manipulating are forms of issues in inhibitory control and mental flexibility, where they break the rules in order to suit their needs. And we help them to look at it. So therapy would be to talk about this, talk about the consequences of it, and help them generate more say relevant habits. If that is difficult, then we also look at training their cognitive executive functions and cognitive control in particular, which then happens without them being aware of the fact that they're replacing this habit. They look at something that maybe as parents you would talk to them, or as grandparents you would talk to them and say this is expected and this is not expected. They profit from that experience subsequent to the training. So most often in ADHD, what happens is, one of the common complaints is, my child does not learn from past experience. That is because the past experience is not being incorporated into the system. With training of executive functions, that will become possible, and therefore the child will start learning to incorporate newer set of rules, and the manipulation can be contained and over a period of time completely disappear.
That's really great. Thanks a lot. I'll try to get in touch with you separately after this one too. get to know
Sure.
more about this one and see how I can help my child.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
If there's no other question, then maybe I can ask another one. I told you I had so many thoughts. I just noted down a few. CBT how is CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, different from cognitive therapy that you mentioned for EF?
Right. So cognitive behavior therapy, in simple layman terms, is a talk therapy, where we talk about what are some of your habits, what are your thoughts, how does that influence your emotions, and how by changing your thoughts you can have an impact on your emotions, and how you can by revisiting your emotions, that can have an impact on your actions. That is a typical or a sort of concise version of what happens in a CBT. Or in a neuropsych intervention, what we do, or the cognitive training, what we do is we don't talk to you about you being aware of your emotions or bring conscious awareness to the thoughts that you have. Instead, it's a like somebody used the word, so I'm just sort of imitating them. They said it's a backdoor entry. So you just allow the brain to replace the thoughts and the emotions automatically without being aware of it, just by working on the executive functions. So like say, if I were to do a CBT with the child, once a week, I would have a conversation with the child. I would set a homework task, think about this, experience this, come back, and then we will talk about it and we'll see how you feel and react thereafter. In a neuropsych intervention, none of this happens. And instead, I present a series of activities. And once the activities are done, this happens 3 days in a week versus once a week in a CBT module. And the brain automatically resets itself and is receptive to the experiences. And the child, by way of conversation, may say, actually, yesterday, this is what happened. And this is what I did. But I think I should not have done this. And then we go into a conversation. So we don't deliberately lead the child to talk about it, but the child might bring it up because he's become more aware. He's able to process his own emotions or reactions to situations. So what we call as insight is automatically built because inhibition and working memory and mental flexibility gets stronger.
Thank you so much.
Maybe a lot of your questions would be answered if you were to do an activity and you realize what really happens in a session with cognitive training. So if we don't have many questions, maybe I can quickly run you through one activity and you'll know what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask about the program that you've done with the teachers who are then, going and doing the curriculum with the school children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this particular program which you had designed was for what, 1 year duration, or how was it monitored? And the mindset of the teachers who come to this kind of program, were there challenges, that normally is, right?
Yeah. So the two programs that I spoke of, I have not developed them. They were developed. One was by Riggs and the other was a California-based program. What they did was they had a teacher training module. Both the programs spoke of a minimum 3-month training program and then booster sessions for the teachers. Once that was done, then through the whole school year, the teachers implemented the program. And then at the end of the year, the children were then assessed for executive functions, and then teacher feedback was sought. And so the CSRP, for example, has been in practice for over 10 years now, and they have a lot of, they've put out a lot of research work which says that subsequent to this, children have improved their executive functions quite significantly. The paths program, jury is still out. There is some weak evidence right now currently, because it's a newer program. There is some weak evidence to say that some executive functions improve, but they still don't have enough information for us to say, this works. There is another program which I have not mentioned, which is known as Tools of Mind, which is a Canadian program done by Adele Diamond, and which works very well, which is meant for the 3 to 5 year olds. And so it's incorporated into the curriculum. So these 3 programs, and the reason why I presented that was, it doesn't have to be outside of a school curriculum. They look at it as anything and everything you do, can you be more mindful of it? And can you encourage the children to do it with a lot of insight? So the Tools of Mind program follows a simple thing, like, you have peer reading programs. And one of the greatest challenges that you have is that when one child is reading, the other child is not listening. So one of the techniques that they thought of was, I would have 2 pictures which are stuck to popsicle sticks, one of a ear and one of the mouth. So the mouth is given to the child who's the reader, and the ear is given to the child who is going to listen to the story being read. And so every time they catch the child with the ear not listening, then the teacher would prompt and say, look at the picture in your hand. And then the child would say, oh, it's a ear. And then what are you expected to do because of this? I'm expected to listen. Are you doing that? No. Then can we get you to listen? So that visual aid followed by a verbal prompt facilitates inhibition and facilitates the child to remember that he or she has to listen to what is going on. And they found over a period of time, just holding that popsicle stick and that visual aid was enough. And by the end, they did not even need the visual aid. And the child, the moment he knew he was to listen, would fit in and follow the program. So that program has been, I think, for over 8 years now, has been used quite extensively in a lot of elementary schools, as they are called in Canada, with children between the ages of 3 to 5, just to facilitate inhibition, mental flexibility, and working memory. And so it's not something that's done separately.
Yeah. Just a reflection listening to your conversation, and because I'm also a reflective practitioner as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'm expected to conduct this program for the children, simultaneously, I'm not aware that my EF is low,
Right.
in the process, right?
Right.
So have there been cases where teachers have actually also transformed when you're doing this you're working with the children, because I realized throughout the session that this is the area that now I really need to look into. Honestly, I'll be upfront. I'm highly reflective and critical of myself. I realize this is one of the reasons I was not able to identify things, and I'm expecting the children to do that. So teachers enrolling into a program are not realizing that they themselves need help.
Right. It happens all the time. And that's why I said, after this talk, your brain will start functioning differently.
Yeah.
And that's a permanent change.
Yeah.
Right? Because you become more reflective.
Yeah.
So the hot and the cold cognition also to answer Shalini's question earlier, the hot and the cold cognition, the hot cognition is a reactive cognition. And the cold cognition is a reflective cognition. So what you are doing right now is a reflective cognition. But if your hot cognition were to hijack the system, you will say, oh, I'm so dumb, I can't do this, I'm not fit to be a teacher. The cold cognition will say, well, hang on, maybe you're low on this, but if you can improve it, then you can still do what you're doing. So the reactive and the reflective, that's why we need to maintain the balance.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
I must say you answer so well and so clearly. It's amazing. Thank you so much, Akila.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No other questions, I guess, Akila.
Okay, sounds good.
So are you going to have the activity now, or
So shall we do the activity?
Yes.
Okay.
That
Then yeah. Then maybe I need one or two volunteers who can do the activity with us. Anybody can volunteer.
Well, if nobody does, I'll volunteer, but
Okay.
I'm the most chatty, so I'd like others to get the chance first.
Yeah. So if nobody volunteers, right? As a teacher, we would then allot. We would choose, right? That's how we threaten.
yeah.
So
It's
since
better you come out.
you come forward, yes.
Yeah.
Anyone? No volunteers at all? That's sad.
I can volunteer myself.
Okay.
Suryanarayanan.
Great. So the volunteers, I don't know if we can pin them onto the.
Yes. So it's going to be Shalini.
Yes, Shalini can be one,
Okay.
and
And Suryanarayan.
Suryanarayan. Yes. Okay. So this is a simple activity, and at the end of the activity, you'll have to tell me what executive function it worked on. And others, of course, you're welcome to play, but then maybe discussion we'll have only the two of them. You're going to see circles, and of course, my geometry has gone wonky. So it might appear as ovals. It doesn't matter. We're still referring to the same shape. So either an oval or circle or a triangle. That's all you're going to see. And you're going to see, they're going to be both shapes. So you're going to see double shapes. For the first part of the activity, you only focus on the shape that's on the outside, right? And when you see a circle, you clap once. When you see a triangle, you clap twice. So 1 for circle, 2 for triangle. Got that? Yeah, okay. Are we ready? And we're focusing on the figure that's on the outside. All right. Ready?
Yep.
Okay.
All others, can you mute yourself, please? Everyone else? Yeah, thank you.
That was a circle. Okay.
Circle and triangle.
Yeah. But we're only on what's on the outside.
Outside circle. Circle.
So that's one clap.
Circle. Yeah. Triangle.
Clap.
Circle.
1 clap.
Yep. Circle. 1 clap.
Okay.
Triangle.
Yeah. 2 claps.
Circle.
Okay.
Triangle. 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 Circle. Triangle. 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 Circle.
Okay.
Triangle.
Now we focus on the figure that's inside. We're still doing circle 1, triangle 2. Got that?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I can only see Shalini. I can't see Suryanarayan at all.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I was not on video. Sorry.
No problem.
I was only on this one.
Okay. Okay, so what we really did, oops, sorry. So what cognitive ability do you think we were working on?
Perception,
Executive function.
executive,
We're looking at inhibition control,
mental flexibility.
We're looking at flexibility, right?
Yes.
What else?
Working memory.
Yes, working memory.
Yeah.
What else?
Yes.
And inhibition.
And inhibition.
All three.
So all three, just a simple activity. And again, when it was circle in a circle or triangle in a triangle, the rule did not matter. So there were times when you did not need to remember the rule, but you needed to recall the rule when it was a triangle in a circle or a circle in a triangle, right? So the congruent situations, there was automatic control, but in the incongruent, you had to switch to executive functions, and you needed all three to be able to do this without errors. With Shalini, I could see there was no cost. The switching was done very effortlessly, but with somebody who has problems in any one of these, the switch would have come at a cost. So really, you don't need the child to be able to read. You don't need the child to be able to, do anything that he or she is not good at. But through games, you can gamify the whole process. If you don't have a laptop, if you don't have access to it, just convert this into, cards and put it on popsicle sticks, and you can do it. Large groups, it only would take 5 minutes. If the child does not know the shapes, you can do colors, or you can just do sit and stand. So when I say sit, you stand. When I say stand, you sit. Simple things like that. 3 days in a week for about 10 minutes, and keep increasing the difficulty level, and it does wonders to the brain.
Such a simple exercise, but
Right.
it is going to make a huge difference. That's great to know.
I also realized that as we went along, it became easier.
Correct.
Like, the flexibility was actually growing, and the brain was kind of identifying the pattern.
Right.
So it became much easier.
Correct. So the initial, it's called an inertia, attentional inertia, because
Yes.
you need that time to switch, which is why giving time is important if you want the child to have a learning curve.
This is so good for adults too, Akila. It's not just.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Simple things like this can make a huge difference.
And Tarannum rightly said, even I was thinking, so many executive functions don't work now.
I actually wanted to ask you, Akila, do executive functions do they become weaker as we grow older?
They do
Because
actually.
I also felt,
Yes, they do become weaker with age.
Okay.
So one is stress, the other is with age, it becomes more and more difficult. And therefore, it's important for us to keep it alive by doing a lot of these activities as well.
Are there gender differences in this?
General differences as in?
Gender. Yeah.
Gender differences, not at the executive function level, but in terms of, is it more verbal or more visuospatial? Clearly, women are more inclined towards better verbal functions, and men are more inclined for better visuospatial functions. But of course, a lot of people would say that there are no such gender differences.
Mhm.
But women are better at maybe multitasking, whereas men are not so good at multitasking. So a lot of these sort of differences, largely because of what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's more a cultural and a habit than
Okay.
gender per se.
Wonderful. As always, your sessions are always very interesting and there's so much to learn.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody else? Okay.
Ma'am, Akila ma'am, can you explain the go, no go task?
Yeah. So supposing I say, I call out names of 3 colors, red, blue, and green. And when I say red, you clap. When I say blue, you snap your fingers. And when I say green, you don't do anything, right?
Okay.
So the go is for red and blue. The no-go is for green. So that's one example of a go, no-go task. Another can be, for red, you snap your fingers. For blue, you clap. Unless I say green. And when I say green, until the next time I say green, you don't do anything. That can be another way of a no-go. So go for certain things, no go for certain things, or go for all stimuli until you see this signal, and then there's a no-go until the next sign tells you to go.
So all this task will help for SNP and rewiring.
Yes. It will help improve, particularly for inhibition, let's say, and that will help rewire your brain.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Right. Okay, if there are no questions, then thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I
Akila. I would really want to thank you for such a wonderful session. Like I said,
Pleasure.
I would like to ask Tarannum to give you a formal vote of thanks. Tarannum, to you, please.
I take this opportunity, Dr. Akila, to thank you on behalf of Brindavan, my teacher.